Hello, and welcome once again to Family Historian. My name is Stephen Conti. Tonight, Family Historian is going to a wedding, and that means we're going to learn about marriage records and how they can help us find our ancestors. And joining me on tonight's show, I am very happy to have as my guest a young man named Brian Schnell. Brian is an up-and-coming historian and genealogist. He is also the assistant director of the Jefferson Township Historical Society and Museum right here in New Jersey. And tonight, these two bachelors are going to teach you about marriage records. And now let's welcome my very good friend, Brian Schnell. Welcome again, Brian.
Thank you for having me back, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be back.
Good. Now, Brian, I went to your Historical Society and Museum in Jefferson Township, New Jersey, and it's a wonderful place. I was there on the opening day of your new exhibit. Tell our viewers the name of the exhibit.
Our current exhibit is Something Borrowed, Something Blue, which is featuring a collection of letters, decorations, and dresses from the Victorian period surrounding their weddings. We also have a collection of community-loaned dresses and memorabilia from our members' exhibits as well as those of the community.
Very good. So I must say that your society has always been the inspiration, and it has given me so many ideas for family historian. Now let's get to these records of marriage. Now there is something called banns of marriage. I don't hear that anymore. This was in the olden days. Can you define the word banns of marriage?
Of course, Stephen. And you're right, you don't hear it that much anymore because it's an antiquated process. Essentially what it would be is during colonial periods, and in Europe even earlier than that, it would be posted notice of a couple's intent of getting married, whether that be in a newspaper or on community boards, listing the couple's names and a list of 3 dates when anybody who would oppose the marriage could come voice their concerns and potentially stop the marriage.
Right.
The last date of which typically was the actual wedding itself. And that is where you get the custom of asking, if anybody has any reason this couple shall not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I wonder if that has ever happened. I've seen it in movies. Maybe years ago it did happen.
I believe it could have happened back when these marriage bans were posted and it was seen as a little more appropriate to voice concerns.
Right.
Now, if you stepped in and did that, you'd probably get thrown out.
Right, yes. Now, we do have 2 examples of bans of marriage, and I believe one is from the year 1800, and my fine guest, Brian, is going to read this to you, and we'll show it to you as well.
Of course, this one is from Boston. Now the inscription reads, "A purpose of marriage between Levi Washburn and Anna Nicholson hath stood entered with me for the space of 14 days, and due publication of such their intention or purpose has been made by asking their banns at 3 several public meetings within the said town as the law directs, certified under my hand," and it gives the date, and it's signed the town clerk, William Cooper.
And that's from 1800?
Yes.
Okay. And now we have another one from what year?
This one is from 1836, and it actually does list the 3 dates.
Okay.
Banns of marriage between John Perry and Sarah Betteridge, and it lists the first time as the 10th of January, the second time as the 17th of January, and the third time as the 24th of January, which would have been their wedding date.
Right. Now, these were published where? How did people know of these bans of marriage?
They would be published in community newspapers, and once printed, they would be posted on community boards.
So the whole town would know of this upcoming marriage?
Yes, the whole town would know.
Okay. Now, nowadays we don't have bans, but we do have newspaper announcements, and we do have an example of one from the 1950s, I believe.
Yes, we do.
And can you tell me who this special bride is?
Of course, Stephen. This announcement is for my grandmother and my grandfather, used with my grandmother's permission. They were married in the 1950s, and some of the names listed are family members of ours.
Right. So that's a good genealogical source. And there is a site that one can go to. Can you tell us that site for newspapers?
Sure, you can go to newspapers.com. They have digitized versions of thousands of newspapers from across time.
Right. And then we have the civil records. And once again, in New Jersey, it varies from state to state. They go back to what time in New Jersey?
We're very lucky to have records that go back as far as May of 1848.
And these are very concise records. And we have one of my actual paternal grandparents from the year 1907. And it gives you all the information on the bride and groom. And then we also have one from 1874. Can you tell us who this is? Because it's connected with your society.
This is correct. This marriage record is actually of the Chamberlain family, George and Ruth Elizabeth, on their wedding date in 1874. They were the family that inhabited what is now the museum.
Right. So now we've done the banns of marriage and the civil records. Now, tell us about church records and where these records can be found.
You can find these records usually in church offices in their records, or sometimes the churches have central archives.
All right. I know the Presbyterians have one in Philadelphia.
That is correct.
Okay, the Presbyterian Historical Society. So you would go right to the church first.
That's correct. You'd go right to the church first, and if they have it on site, they will let you see it. But if they don't have it on site, they'll direct you to their central archive.
Right. Now, there are also church records that have been printed, and I know we have one for New Jersey that goes way back, New Jersey marriage records, and these are very good to have.
I agree with you, Stephen, because you can get a myriad of information off of them.
Right, right. Now, we talked about records, and in a previous show, we told you the difference between a record and a certificate. And now we're going to show you some very beautiful and colorful and very ornate marriage certificates. And where can these be found, Brian?
You can typically find these marriage certificates, antique stores, family documents, sometimes even in museums if it's a notable family.
And what kind of information will be on there?
You can find information such as a full name for the groom, his place of residence, the same for the bride. You can find family members on there, the pastor, wedding dates, geographic locations where the wedding happened.
Right, but this is the certificate
Yes.
of the actual record. Okay. All right, and these are in private collections too. You can find people collect these.
Yes, they do.
Okay.
A lot of them do come from private collections and are loaned to museums to be digitized for public usage.
Right. Now, let's talk about the various kinds of marriages, okay? And there are many kinds. There's not only one, but we'll start with the most common one, and we hope the one that people stick to, monogamy. Can you define monogamy?
Of course. Monogamy is basically the simplest form of marriage, two partners together. Nobody else in the marriage, happily together.
One partner.
Yes.
Mono, one person.
Yes.
Okay. And what about bigamy? I've heard about bigamy.
Bigamy is a little bit of a taboo subject because it's being married to a second person while still being married to the first.
Which is illegal.
It is very illegal.
Very illegal, okay. And then we have one, polygamy. And you gave me a very fine definition of this one, polygamy.
Yes, I did. This is where you can have multiple partners in your marriage. A very good example of this would be Brigham Young of the LDS Church, who is on record of having over 50 wives at the time of his death.
I think this is part, well, years ago it was part of their religion. Is
Yes,
that
it
correct?
was.
To have multiple wives. And in some cultures you can have multiple wives.
Yes, you can.
Okay. Now we have one that I would say most of our ancestors practiced, and that is endogamy. And this is where you marry somebody within your same socioeconomic grouping. Is that correct?
Socioeconomic grouping within a culture, within a town, or in certain rural areas within a village.
Right. You marry the boy next door or the girl next door.
That's correct, Stephen.
Okay. And we do have some examples of this. We'll show you right now. We have Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who were first cousins.
Yes, they were.
So that's keeping it in the family, okay? Also, Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth, and Philip, I believe, were third cousins.
Third cousins, yes.
They were both great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. So this is an endogamous marriage. FDR and Eleanor, I don't know, that they were more distant, I believe.
They were much more distant. I believe third or fourth cousins, but because of how close-knit their family was, they knew each other for a very long time.
Right, and now we're going to get into showbiz. Jerry Lee Lewis, who married a 13-year-old cousin, which was legal in that state. I don't know what state they were in.
I'm not sure either. It was legal in that state and less questionable at the time.
So that is endogamy.
Yes, it is.
All right. Now, what is the opposite of endogamy?
The opposite of endogamy is exogamy, where you would marry somebody outside of your town, outside of your socioeconomic status, outside of your race, basically all of that.
Right, okay, so it's endogamy and exogamy, okay. Now, we've heard of what we call allied families, and I'm going to have Brian explain what are allied families, because we all have them in our families.
Allied families, whether we know we have them or not, are when two families become inseparable. They don't, sometimes they will marry in, but typically they are just inseparable, very, very close family friends. A very famous example is actually Abraham Lincoln and Daniel Boone's families.
Right, and you did research on these two families. So these are families that marry into your family.
Yes.
And vice versa, okay. And what was the research you did on the Lincolns and the Boones, if you can tell our viewers?
Sure. I found that a distant ancestor of Abraham Lincoln, I believe to be his second or third great-grandfather, was extremely close with a distant family member of Daniel Boone's.
Right.
Now, the relationship was not fully clarified as to how far back from Daniel Boone, but they became very, very close friends, and Lincoln's ancestor named Boone's ancestor in his will.
Really? So the Lincolns and the Boones were related to each other.
Yes,
and
they
you
were.
told me they were neighbors or something?
Yes, they had neighboring farmsteads.
Right. And what was the exact relationship? Was it Lincoln's aunt or uncle? Or you told me before tonight's taping. What was the relation?
Lincoln's uncle actually married Daniel Boone's niece.
Lincoln, say it once more.
Lincoln's uncle married Daniel Boone's niece. And of course, that is one of the more recent and more well-known connections, but there were a number of others throughout the family.
So these two families were allied?
Yes, they were.
Okay, very good. Now, I do want to talk about and then we'll have a quick review, the Jefferson Historical Society, okay? And we have some various pictures of the contents of that society. Can you explain what you have there right now?
Sure. Right now, as I said earlier, we have our Victorian weddings under the name of Something Borrowed, Something Blue.
Right.
We have some dresses from the 1870s. We have letters from that time period. We've got decorations and reproduction decorations of the period. But we're also playing host to community-loaned objects from weddings that they've been through.
Right.
We've got from the 1900s all the way up until, I believe, the 1960s. We have a special collection as well on wartime weddings, where we go into how weddings were approached during the World War II period.
Right, okay. And you also have something, you have a Civil War object. Can you tell our viewers about that?
Yes, we do. In display cases in the main room, we have a small selection of Civil War wedding memorabilia. We have some ribbons, we have some photographs, we have an actual Civil War wedding certificate. More impressive to me, though, is we have a Civil War wedding ring that was attributed to a Union soldier from the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse.
Very good. So if we have any young ladies out there who are planning your wedding, you might get some ideas for wedding dresses by going to the Jefferson Historical Society and Museum. Okay, great. All right, let's have a quick review here. The sources that we can use are the banns of marriage.
That is correct.
Where can these be found?
You can find the banns of marriage on different genealogical websites, Ancestry, Family Search. You can find them online. Sometimes, if you have an older family, you can find them in your own family documents.
Right.
And so, if you have an older town, occasionally you can find them within town records, but it's uncommon.
Right. Now, and when did they stop doing the banns? In what year? Around what year?
I can't really tell. You can't really tell what year per se. It kind of faded out gradually as more commonplace. This is when the wedding is. This is some information. Became more popular.
Right. And tell us once again about the church records.
The church records can be found either on site in the church records, or if they don't have them on site, they'll direct you to a central archive where they're held.
Right. And then they also come in printed sources.
Yes, they come in printed sources. You can find them sometimes on Amazon, sometimes on other websites, or even from a parish web shop.
Right. And then we talked about the marriage certificates, which is, these are the very ornate and decorative ones that
They're
you can
quite
frame.
beautiful.
And these go how far back, would you say?
You could conceivably find them as far back as the mid-1700s.
And you found one recently, you said.
I did. It was more of a banns of marriage wedding certificate. It wasn't a full certificate, but it was a blend.
Right.
From the mid-1750s, actually.
Very good. Well, this has been a wonderful interview, learning about marriage records and the different kinds of marriage. We talked about monogamy, we talked about bigamy, polygamy, and I guess all of our ancestors were endogamous. And the opposite of endogamy, once again?
That would be exogamy.
Which is?
That is where you marry outside of your social economic status, your culture, or your town.
Or religion or
religion
race.
or race, yes.
Okay, I think that's the way most people go nowadays, which is fine with me, which is great.
Whatever makes them happy.
Right, okay. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on Family Historian for the third time, learning about marriage records with historian and genealogist Brian Schnell. Thank you so much, Brian.
Of course, Stephen.
Right. And on that note, as I say every time, we are all descendants of ancient civilizations. Genealogy is your key to the history of your family. And so until next time, this is Stephen Conti wishing you the very best of luck in your research, and above all, happy ancestor hunting. Good night.